On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation.
This program is Chapel of Love, the story of New Orleans girl group the Dixie Cups, featuring Steve Bergsman and Courtney McCreary. Steve Bergsman is a longtime journalist who has written over a dozen books. His most recent book was a biography of Screaming Jay Hawkins. Courtney McCreary is Senior Publicity and Promotions Manager at the University Press of Mississippi. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bergsman and Courtney McCreary.
Hey Steve, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well. Where do we find you today?
I am at my house in Jackson, where the University Press is located.
Do we have autumn there in Jackson yet?
Well, we are. So, could you repeat your question, please?
Do we have autumn? The season.
Oh, autumn. Okay, got it.
Sorry, I have a New York accent.
There. Yeah. It is 70 degrees. So yes, for Mississippi, it is chilly outside. So yeah, been enjoying that nice weather. I wanted to ask you, so, I know unfortunately Rosa couldn't be here today. How is she doing?
So Rosa she did the first interview and she wasn't feeling well, and it turned out she had COVID. She had both her vaccines, and her sister got COVID, and then she got COVID, and she really has not, it's been slow recovery for her. So she's not feeling well, and we hope the best for her.
Yes.
So I'm sitting in for both me and Rosa.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm so bummed not to get to talk to her today, but I'm sure this is going to be a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. So an easy question to start off with today. Could you tell us a little bit about the book?
So Chapel of Love looks like the usual memoir or biography of a singer from previous generations who has decided to finally go on record with their rise to success. But Chapel of Love, the story of New Orleans girl group, the Dixie Cups, is much more than that. Because of the Dixie Cups, in particular Rosa, they were abused managerially, they were abused financially, and finally Rosa was abused physically. So I feel the story has some resonance today, especially with the Me Too movement. So I think if you just think this is a memoir, you're missing the story, because what the Dixie Cups went through, we're still seeing today. And I mean, just look at all the business with, say, Britney Spears and her father. So
right, yeah.
a lot of singers, even female singers, even today, are getting mismanaged or abused, or somebody has taken them out of the picture over their leadership of their own careers.
Right. Yeah. It's funny you say Britney Spears. I was thinking a lot about Rosa lately as I've been watching this stuff with Britney Spears. So how did you meet Rosa? How did you come to write a book with her?
Well, so this is interesting. So I was working on a book with Beverly Lee of the Shirelles. Now, the Shirelles were the most important girl group of the early 60s up until the advent of the Supremes. So, and they were a wonderful group, had a lot of hits, in particular, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, which I think is the defining song of the girl group era. They had another one, number one song with Soldier Boy, and Dedicated to the One I Love. So these are they had a lot of hit records, and Beverly Lee is one of the two. They were a quartet, and two of them are still alive, and Beverly Lee is one of them. She decided to write her memoir, and I was helping her with that. And I decided to interview a number of people that knew Beverly well back in the day. And Beverly suggested I talk to the Dixie Cups. I guess she was friendly with the Dixie Cups going back to the Dixie Cups' early years. So I interviewed Rosa and Barbara, and they were telling me, so nowadays, if you do a concert, there's usually one big headliner, and that's the show, and everybody goes to see that headliner. Sometimes there's an opening act, so maybe there's two people at a concert. But back in the 50s and 60s, the shows were extensive tours, usually by bus. They do 30 to 40 different locations around the country. And the concerts consisted of maybe 15 different groups and singers. So what would happen was, somebody would sing one or two songs off the stage. The next person would go one or two songs and off the stage. Next person would go, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd all tour together on these buses around the country. And the Dixie Cups, by the time the Dixie Cups joined these tours, the Shirelles were old pros already. And the Shirelles adopted the Dixie Cups and taught them the ins and outs of the tours. It wasn't such an easy thing, all these tours, especially for the Black performers as they went into the South, because of all the segregation in the South. A lot of times the Black performers, for example, couldn't stay in the hotels where the white performers were, or the Black performers couldn't eat at a restaurant where the white performers could eat. So it wasn't easy. So there was a lot of planning, especially for the Black performers. And the Shirelles taught the ropes to the Dixie Cups, and the Dixie Cups were always thought highly of Beverly Lee and the other girls of the Shirelles. So I did the book with Beverly Lee, and it was finished. And then when it was all over, Beverly Lee decided she didn't know what to do with the book. She wouldn't even want to get published. There were a number of publishers who wanted the book, but she said no to all of them. And then about that time, Rosa called me and said, I'd like to do a book as well. And I thought, well, the Shirelles were very important. There's a book there, the Dixie Cups. They had a couple of big hits, maybe not so important. I wasn't sure that I wanted to go through that process again. And especially with a group that wasn't as important as the Shirelles. And then Rosa told me her story, and it's a very lengthy story of the years of management and mismanagement and the turmoil they went through all the years after they stopped being with their manager. It just seemed to go on forever, the torment. And I thought, well, there's a book there. Somebody needs to do this book, and it turned out that somebody was me. So I said to Rosa, I'd help her with the book. And that's the book we have today, Chapel of Love.
Great. That's an awesome story of how you got together. So I was flipping through the book a little bit to prepare for this. And can you talk a little bit? So who are the Meltones? Is that how the Dixie Cup started? Is that the original name?
So let me take you back. So this is at the start of the 60s. And Barbara and Rosa Hawkins, Rosa was still in high school. She was about 16. Her sister's 3 years older. And it was her sister who was very involved in the New Orleans pop music scene, local clubs. And there were a lot of, and New Orleans was one of those great nodes of creativity. A lot of pop musicians came through there. A lot of pop musicians grew up there, or they recorded there, or they went to all the clubs that were on Bourbon Street and all around New Orleans. So it was a very popular place, and Barbara was involved in that. Her sister was in high school, and she was just being a teenager in high school. But they all sang because their mother had been a singer, and they sang in church with their mother. So they all can sing. So Barbara and a friend and two boys organized a local group called the Meltones. And they organized to sing at these amateur music contests they used to do in New Orleans quite a bit for the teenagers. And one of the boys had to drop out. His mother got sick, and they needed a fourth, and they couldn't find another boy. And Barbara said, well, let's bring my sister in, because she sings deeper than the rest of us. She's not a tenor, or I guess a baritone. I'm not sure, but she had a deeper voice. So they brought Barbara in, and I'm sorry, Barbara brought Rosa, her sister Rosa, in, and then the Meltones were now 3 girls and 1 boy, and they competed at the local amateur contest. They didn't win, but a talent scout named Joe Jones was in the audience. Now, Joe Jones was kind of an interesting fellow. He'd been around the New Orleans music scene since the end of the 40s, when he got out of the Navy. He backed a number of, he had a band, and they backed a number of musicians who'd come through the South, B.B. King, Shirley and Lee, Mickey and Sylvia. So he was an experienced musician, and he got his big break in 1960. He had a #3 record called You Talk Too Much. And then could never find a follow-up record, and his career sort of slid away. And he thought he'd stay in the music business by, talent scouting, maybe managing somebody. And he sat in on the amateur contest, and liked the Meltones. And to make a long story short, he wanted to manage the Meltones. They were teenagers. He had to go visit the mother, and he talked the mother into, by this time what happened was, so the Meltones were 3 girls and a boy, and then Joe Jones talked the mother into letting him manage them and take them to New York to get a recording contract. But this was really the heyday of the girl group era. And Joe Jones thought 3 girls was better than 3 girls and 1 boy. So he managed to talk the boy into dropping out, and now he had 3 girls, and they were Rosa Hawkins, Barbara Hawkins, and their cousin, Joan Marie Johnson. And he became their manager. He also had, because they were still teenagers, he also got parental rights, you might say, over the girls. So he had really control over their whole life. And this is really the genesis of where things went bad, because they were teenagers. Joe Jones was an adult, and they assumed he was their manager, and they sort of belonged to him, his managerial skills. But in real life, the talent owns the manager. They can fire or not fire the manager. But they were so young, they didn't know anything about the music, and they thought, oh, well, the manager is in charge, and he can fire one of us if he wants. But that wasn't the case. They just didn't know any better. They were naive and young. And they actually had never been out of Louisiana, Mississippi in their whole life. And here is Joe Jones taking them to New York.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit more about Joe Jones in a second, but first, I saw a couple of other people, Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Berry. Could you tell us a little bit about them and how the Dixie Cups gained their attention?
Sure. So Joe Jones takes the Meltones and a few other acts he discovered to New York. And he didn't have any contacts in New York, though he said he did. And the first person he called was a woman who, not yet Sylvia Robinson, but she had a big hit in the mid-50s with Mickey Baker. They were known as Mickey and Sylvia, and their big hit was Love is Strange. It was a huge, one of the most important hits of the 1950s. And they never found a follow-up either. And Sylvia was looking to do other things as well. Joe Jones calls her from New Orleans, says, I have these girls here I want to take. Can you help me out? And she says, yes. Now, I'm just going to diverge here a bit, because Sylvia, who became Sylvia Robinson when she got married, and she actually became, she and her husband opened a recording studio and created a label. And this label became, in the 1970s, All Platinum. That was the name of the label. And All Platinum recorded the first popular hip hop song, it was rap at the time. So she became the godmother of rap, Sylvia. So anyway, so I just wanted to give you that background. So
Yeah,
the
that's
girls
cool,
come
yeah.
up, Sylvia finds them a place to stay, and Joe takes them around, literally hitting the pavement, walking the pavement, knocking on doors, record producers, songwriters in Manhattan. And finally, they make their way to the Brill Building in New York. Now, there were two buildings on Broadway where all the small record producers had offices, all the freelance songwriters had offices, and just about any freelance person in the business, singers had offices. And one of them was the Brill Building, right not far from Times Square. And the Brill Building was a mid-rise office building, and it really was a warren, a rabbit's warren of little tiny offices. Most of them had a upright piano, and everybody did their business there. And all the famous songwriters of the 60s, Carole King, for example, and they all had offices there. And a lot of the women songwriters, and they were very young, they were teenagers or just out of teenagehood. A lot of them were young married, and they were songwriting teams with their husband. And Ellie Greenwich, she formed a songwriting team with her husband, Jeff Barry, Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry. And they had actually a lot of hits in the early 60s. So anyway, Joe Jones brings the girls by, and they finally end up in the office of Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry. And they had a song that they sung. This was their song. It was written by a friend in New Orleans, and they sang the song for Ellie and Jeff. And Ellie and Jeff were very impressed, and they were impressed for one reason. The girl group sound, exemplified by, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow by the Shangri-Las, or Leader of the Pack by, oh, geez, I don't remember anymore. But they were almost all these songs had a lead and then 3 or 4 girls singing background, 2 to 4 girls singing background, because the girl group sound evolved out of the 1950s doo-wop sound. And the 1950s doo-wop always had a lead singer and 3 or 4 background singers. So, by 1960, when the girl group sound was beginning to explode, it was a lead singer and background singers. But the Dixie Cups, they learned their craft in church with their mother, and they all sang in harmony. So here comes Rosa, Barbara, and Joan Marie, and they sing 3-part harmony. And that impressed Ellie and Jeff, because it wasn't the usual type of girl sound. Mm-hmm. So all the songwriters had songs that they wrote. Some of them were hits, some of them weren't hits, but they all were sitting. They always had them all sitting around on recordings or ready to take out again for whoever walked in the door. And one of those songs was "Chapel of Love." So "Chapel of Love" was written by Jeff and Ellie and Phil Spector. And it was written for Phil Spector's, some of the girls that Phil Spector liked to record, such as the Crystals. And there were two previous versions of "Chapel of Love" that never went anywhere. So the song was just sitting around. So Jeff and Ellie took out the song, played it for the girls. How do you like it? And the girls didn't know what to make of it, didn't like it. But they said, I'll tell you what, we're going to leave this here with you for about 20 minutes. Look at it, see what you can do with it, and we'll come back and we'll hear your version of it. And that's what they did. So 20 minutes later, they come back, and then the girls had reorganized it again in 3-part harmony. And Jeff and Ellie liked what they heard. They called in their bosses, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who've been around the rock and roll industry for forever. They wrote "Hound Dog" for Elvis Presley. And they had, their label was Rebirth Records. And they decided to go ahead and record the Meltones, but they didn't like the name of the Meltones. And finally, they wanted them to change it, and eventually it became, the Meltones became the Dixie Cups. So, a lot of artists, even today, they struggle. They take some years to get their careers going, they record an album or stream something today. But back in that day, you recorded a 45, which was a platter, a very small platter with one song on the front side and one song on the back side. And this is what everybody bought. Nobody buys CDs anymore, for example. Everything's a stream. But 50s and 60s, you still bought 45s. So people would, record 45s, and they may get to the 10th 45 and still nothing. But the Dixie Cups recorded "Chapel of Love," first try, first time out of the gate, #1 song. So they were extremely lucky, and there they were, suddenly stars. So now you're going to ask me about Joe Jones at this point, and I'm going to go back to Joe Jones. So
you got me.
So Joe Jones had no other outside income. His income now was the Dixie Cups. And that's what he exploited. For instance, so they brought him to New York. They had temporary stay that Sylvia Robinson had managed for them. Right after the recording, they went back to New Orleans. The song became a hit. They came back to New York. Joe Jones found them an apartment for the three of them in a building in New York, and apartment for himself, same building, top floor. All this, by the way, is being paid for out of future royalties from the Dixie Cups, including his apartment. And Joe Jones, felt that he needed a car too, because in case he had to take the Dixie Cups around to not auditions, but concerts and meet DJs and all that. So that came out of the Dixie Cups as well. His managerial cut came out of the Dixie Cups. In fact, the Dixie Cups had no money because Joe Jones managed their money, and they didn't even get allowance. If they needed money, they had to go to Joe Jones. So they were living in New York. They were rock stars, but you might say they were impoverished because somebody was managing their money and it wasn't them. But it gets more insidious because, Chapel Love sold 2 million records, something like that. And there are other songs. They had a number of other big songs. People say Iko Iko. And And what Joe Jones would do, he'd go to Redbird Records and say, the Dixie Cups, they want to send some money to their parents down in New Orleans. I need it in advance. So you get advance on future royalties from Redbird, but that money never went to the Dixie Cups. Matter of fact, they never knew that Joe Jones was doing that. He'd keep the money for his own expenses. So later, when the Dixie Cups finally went to get their royalties for all the sales of Chapel of Love, they each got $700. The record sold 2 million records.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And they each got $700. And they said, what happened? Where's our money? And then somebody had to explain them that all these years, Joe Jones was taking out these advances from all the futures royalties. There was nothing left, almost nothing left. So that sort of began it for the problems that they would have with Joe Jones going forward. Now, it gets worse, and there are a lot of bad stories with Joe Jones, but the one I focus on in the book happened a little later. They did 2 tours of Great Britain, and I believe this was the second tour, and they had a good time in Great Britain. They they got to party with the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and Joe Jones and the girls, they did a lot of shopping in London. Joe Jones actually excelled at shopping. As a matter of fact, on this second trip, he bought thousands of dollars worth of goods, which he paid for by check with a checking account that had no money in it. So he was in fact hiding checks, and his thinking was that he would get out of London and fly back to New York before they discovered that there was no money behind all these checks he wrote all over London town. And the girls didn't know that, so they're all of them are in the airport terminal waiting to get on their plane to New York when the London Bobbies arrive and arrest Joe for kiting checks, and they take him away. Now remember, the girls had no control over their money. They're sitting in the airport with no money. Everything they ever did was managed by Joe Jones. They have no idea what to do. And then they say to themselves, oh, who do we know? Do we know anybody in London? And it turned out they did, because on one of those big road tours in the US, one of the groups that toured with them was another British invasion band called the Animals. And they had a big hit with, I'm trying to think. Oh, I can't, well, I'm sorry. I can't think of the name.
That's right.
The House of the Rising Sun, there it was. So they had a number one record with House of the Rising Sun, and they had a lot of subsequent records. The lead singer was Eric Burdon. And who do we know? Oh, we know these guys from the Animals. Let's call them. Maybe they can help us out. And they eventually get Eric Burdon. And Eric, really nice guy. He says, I'll tell you what, go to the taxi and go to this address. That's my apartment. There's a key there under the mat or something. And you can use my apartment when you're in New York, in London, because you have no place else to stay. He does that kindness for the girls, and then he gets his lawyer to help Joe Jones get him out of jail. So the lawyer does his job, and he managed to do that, and he gets Joe Jones out of jail. And Joe Jones comes back to the apartment where the girls are staying, and Joe's all puffed up. Oh, I was in jail. I got out. I'm a big deal. They couldn't get me. Well, they could have gotten me, but he's all full of himself. And the girl's subservient as always. Oh, let's make you dinner. Or what do you want for dinner? You want do this, do that. And the arrangements in the apartment was that the three girls shared Eric's king size bed, I guess. So they slept there, and Joe would sleep on the couch. Middle of the night, Joe goes into the bedroom and pushes against Rosa, and waking her up, and Rosa pushes him off the bed, and he gets angry, comes back, pushes against Rosa again. Meanwhile, the other two gals are sleeping, and I don't want to get graphic on this, but he has his way with Rosa at that moment. And the thing you have to remember this, so Rosa, she became a Meltone Dixie Cups right out of high school. She really never had a boyfriend, and I never asked her if she kissed anybody before all that. So she really was, let's just say, a novice at that moment. And in fact, Joe Jones raped her right there on the bed. And as she tells it, there were 2 nights in Eric's apartment, and the next night she said, well, I'm going to sleep on the couch. And Eric shared the bed with the other 2 women. And she said, I didn't sleep a moment that night. And I had a knife with me just in case Joe Jones tried it again. He didn't. But here's the story. So they all go back to New York, and the girls say, well, we need to pay back Eric Burden for his help with the lawyer. And Joe Jones says, forget it. I'm not paying that guy back at all. I'm out of London. I'm not going to pay him back, blah, blah, blah. And then in the subsequent weeks, so he had a key to the girl's apartment, and he would come down. Meanwhile, he has a wife in New Orleans. He's living with a girlfriend up on the top floor of this apartment building, but he comes down every so often to have sex with poor Rosa, who was cowed by him. And he would always threaten that he'd throw her out of the group if she complained. So that's the type of person that Joe Jones was. So
yeah,
I could go on. So next question.
Yeah, no, that's terrible. So how long, do you know how long he was in the picture? So like, when did they finally get free of him?
So here's the interesting thing about the career of the Dixie Cups. Their recording career, not their touring career, because they toured forever. And if it wasn't for COVID, they'd probably still be touring, except for Joan Marie Johnson. She couldn't take it anymore, and she dropped out of the group very early on. But as a recording act, they were only at it for a year. And that was because of Joe Jones. So while Joe Jones was down in New Orleans, the Dixie Cups were back in the recording studio, and they were waiting around between sessions, and just for fun, they decided to sing amongst themselves a chant, a New Orleans chant that they knew that their grandmother used to sing. And they were just having fun singing it, banging on Coke bottles and stuff. And they didn't know that the record producer and arranger were in the studio behind the window, and they liked this sound so much they recorded the whole thing. And that, just playing around, that recording really was Iko Iko, one of their best known hits, and a staple of New Orleans Mardi Gras today. So Joe Jones gets back, and he's kind of furious because, for one thing, even the people at Rebirth didn't trust Joe Jones. And when they got Iko Iko recorded, they listed the Dixie Cups as the songwriters for the song. Joe Jones gets back, he's furious because he wants a piece of that. He says, Iko Iko was my song. I should be as the songwriter. Now, this is all important because you get songwriter royalties, of course. So, but Redbird said, no, you're not getting, the Dixie Cups wrote this, they were there. They said it's their song, you're not getting on this. So Joe Jones was pissed off and he decides to take the Dixie Cups to another record label. And he does, he says, look, we're not at Redbird anymore, we're going over to somebody else. And I'm not sure, I think it was ABC Paramount, they put it at the time. Now, he does that, and they start recording with ABC Paramount, but there's a problem because they're under contract at Redbird. So, of course, there's lawsuits, and the end result was that the Dixie Cups could not record with ABC Paramount, and they weren't going to record anymore with Redbird either. And they never got really another label, and that was the end of their recording career. So that's the first part of the Dixie Cups story. And eventually the Dixie Cups and Joe Jones went their separate ways. But Joe Jones, over the next decade, I mean, this going on for decades afterwards, would harass and torment the Dixie Cups every which way. He claimed, for example, he claimed he wrote Iko Iko, and then they had to take him to court, and it was proven he didn't. He claimed he owned the rights to their name, the Dixie Cups. He didn't, but they had to go to court over this. If they were appearing someplace, he would call the venue and say, you can't have the Dixie Cups because I own the rights to their name. And the venue didn't want to get involved in a hassle, and they say, okay, we'll just won't have the Dixie Cups on the venue. I mean, this would go on for years, and then they continually have to bring them to court. And for a while there, they were so harassed, they decided to change their name to the Dixie Cups with a K, for example. But they really were the Dixie Cups, and it was a silly maneuver. So they continually had to go to court over the years and prove it. I mean, if the Dixie Cups were in New Orleans, he'd call the department stores and say, if they come to your store, don't let them charge anything. They're acting illegally. I mean, he'd harass them. He was. I always say this book is a book of abuse and obsession. And Joe Jones was obsessed with the Dixie Cups. He could not let them be.
Yeah, that's horrible. But I mean, you mentioned that they're still performing now today.
Well, up until COVID.
Not for COVID, but
Yeah. So the Dixie Cups had numerous, Jo Marie Johnson left early. She got so fed up with Joe Jones at one point, she just took a box of 45 records and poured it over his head and said, I'm going home. I'm going back to New Orleans. And when I say they didn't have any money, she didn't have any money. She had to call her parents. They were now famous pop stars, but she didn't have a cent. She had to call her parents to send her money so she could fly home to New Orleans. And that is it. And she never again wanted to be a pop star. So at first, sometimes Joe Jones would find a girlfriend or so and make that the third Dixie Cups. But over the years, after they split with Joe Jones, they had a different third. And when they were growing up, they were very close friends with the Neville brothers, a big pop family, you might say, R&B family out of New Orleans. And one of the sisters, Thelgra, had been friends with Barbara Hawkins since high school. And you might say she was the third member of the Dixie Cups in recent years. And they still performed around. And then COVID came, and they haven't performed since. I don't know what's going to happen going forward since Rosa is not doing well. And they all had other jobs. I mean, there wasn't enough over the years work for them to just be the Dixie Cups. Barbara got her real estate license, and Rosa was Joan Marie Johnson and Barbara were very short, but Rosa was tall and thin, and she became a model. So she did modeling in New Orleans, and then she actually became an instructor at one of those big modeling agencies, John Casablanca, or one of those national chains. So she was actually an instructor for a while. So they had other gigs as well. Now they're, I don't want to say, this is a funny story. So they never, both Barbara and Rosa wouldn't let me put their birth dates in the book.
Right.
So they say, oh, we still perform. Well, I don't want anybody to think we're too old to perform. So, I mean, you can get their birth dates online, on Wikipedia or wherever, but you won't find it in the book because they refuse to let me put that in there.
Right. Well, they still look great for 45. So
that's right. They still look great.
Yeah. This is a really great story. It's one, I think, of a lot of heartbreak, but resilience. And to end on this, I kind of wanted to kind of end with kind of a fun question to kind of bring us back to the music and the songs, which is kind of what led them on this journey. And so I wanted to ask you, Steve, for everyone listening, what's your favorite Dixie Cup song?
Well, so Chapel of Love, it goes on forever. It's been in many, many movies. And I think Rolling Stone, when it did its 500 best songs of all time or something, Chapel of Love was on the list. And so it to this day, it's still recognized as a great song. And even people of your generation, they know the song. Yeah. They just
I knew it exactly. As soon as I saw the title of the book, I knew exactly what the song was. I've seen it, I've heard it, I've seen the movies and on TV shows. Like, yeah, I know the song.
Yeah, so it's a great song, but it's not my favorite. My favorite song is Iko Iko. I just think that rhythm and beat of Iko Iko is great, and Iko Iko has been used in many movies as well. And there's a lot of controversy on the original, who owns the original rights to the song. Now, there was a kind of a version of Iko Iko in the early 50s that was a record, and it didn't go anywhere. But it was one of those, there was, in New Orleans, there were a lot of, I call them chants. They would probably call them something else. And a lot of it was associated with Mardi Gras. These were songs or sounds that were associated with Mardi Gras forever. And Iko Iko was one of these chants or songs. And so people would create records out of it. And the girls knew it because their grandmother used to sing this. And when they were just fooling around in the studio. And I think their version of Iko Iko is just wonderful. And it's my favorite of the Dixie Cup songs. And I tell them that all the time, but I think they just believe it's like everybody else. Chapel of Love is their favorite song. My favorite song. So before I let you go, I just want a note. I just want to reiterate that, something I said in the beginning, that if they're going to look at this book and say this is a memoir or just another biography of a pop singer or pop singers, and it's really Rosa's memoir. I helped to write it, but I still think it resonates today. I think that whole business of managerial abuse of especially the female singers, or especially of the African American singers. I still think, that kind of stuff goes on today. And in this Me Too movement world, I think people need to go back and look at how far back this kind of thing happened. And although you see it today, you saw it 50 years ago as well.
Mhm. That's so true. Well, thank you for talking to me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed it, Courtney. And when you're back there at the University of Mississippi Press, take care of my book and Rosa's
I
book.
will. I will.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.